keen that members of the audience be given maximum time. So can I suggest that everyone who talks tries to keep it really tight? I do want to begin with the panel very quickly, but could I ask for very quick answers to the question? Some of you have already answered this, but what do you see? I was going to say is threshold 9, but now I have to ask, what do you see as the next 1 or 2 thresholds? Can I have a quick answer from the panels, and then I'll just open the discussion out?
Developing an effective sense of coherent global action.
Right, right.
I would say that it's actually the challenge is inside of us. Some of the other speakers actually spoke on this, and I think that's very much the case. That the real threshold is for us to extend a sense of awareness, to understand our brotherhood and sisterhood in space and in time. To me, that's the next real threshold.
So both are hinting at something like a sense of global citizenship. And
for
as
me,
a historian,
but for me, that has to include the temporal direction.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if I step out of the energy space for a moment, which is the natural extension of threshold 8 in the energy sense, I think it is the same thing. It's a shift in our worldview that moves beyond. The layered diagram focuses on particular parts of the economy, particular nation states, particular societies, but then it moves to the global level. I think shifting down our view of history, historical change to the global level, and the fact that we are citizens of the cosmos living on Earth would be a useful shift in perspective.
So shift in perspective too. Clément, I'm going to confine you to maximum two thresholds.
Oh, well, as I said, I think it's a kind of global brain powered by solar energy. But yes, I'm also I agree the psychological part is very important, and that we need to entertain new values about complexity building, energy preserving, which are universal values beyond the human species.
Yeah, look, all of the above, but to really shoehorn in that idea, especially on a philosophical or metaphysical level, of entertaining the idea that our futures on a quite small scale are not necessarily fully biologically human.
Revolution in production or flow of energy analogous to those of agriculture or industry, though if past history is any guide, we may not get it right this time. Throughout the agrarian era, you had downturns before you had that upswing and that explosion again. So if there is a next time, I would think that much more likely. As for a threshold beyond that, if we actually make it through the sort of crisis, the limitations that we face with current modes of production and the limitation of our resources, I think if we make it through this one, there actually will be a long period of acceleration, possibly along the lines of what Elise suggests.
Jeffrey.
I'm extremely pessimistic. I don't know that a group global 7 billion hug is going to get us there. It depends on what happens on Sunday evening, but if Paris doesn't do it, we're going to have to go outside of the political circle as a social movement that really means business, to not have a global group hug, but to say, this has got to be fixed. There aren't any options to kind of negotiate a collective, lovely mind. This is going to have to be fixed. I was interested in this whole discussion about a hockey stick I saw that was a virtual hockey stick. And it was a hockey stick where every person spoke and virtually everyone said something that was alarming, but not alarmist. They didn't use alarmist language. But what they said was alarming. And then almost everyone at the end of their talk finished with a little uptick, a hockey stick of optimism. But their talk didn't give grounds for that optimism. I think we're being human beings and being far too optimistic about this. I think we've got a bloody big problem. And I think we've got to go out and solve it.
Yeah. Okay, can I open it out to the audience? Okay. There's one there. Can I take you later, Mike, because you've had a shot?
If I could just add for one moment on a more pessimistic angle, I mean, if we are relegating ourselves to a 7 billion person group hug, you know, the uptick there would be we've got a good chance of smothering ourselves. And I'd agree, yeah, there's this tendency towards the positive, whether it be discussing the problems of the Anthropocene or even the heat death of the universe. We always want to look for that nice little nugget of optimism there. I don't recall ending my presentation with an uptick, though. I think it was some sarky comment about Johnny Depp's dogs, just for the record.
I actually think we have the opposite problem. I think I see a lot of fatalism and certain doom, and I think that can be very dangerous, and people do have to feel empowered and believe in solutions. So we got to be careful with that balance.
I didn't say we didn't have to do something. I said that it's not doom and gloom and let's go into the fetal position. It's doom and gloom and let's do something about this.
Right.
We must do something about it. And the imperative, the clock's really ticking.
I'm in 100% in agreement. If there's anything positive we could do to generate political momentum, it would not to end our speeches with positive notes, but get angry, get very angry, and continue getting angry, and stay angry, and start soon.
As a Russian historian, I must admit I always am skeptical about whether anger is a good motivator.
Well, before I get arrested for incitement to riot, I will clarify. You need a lot more clamor on this political issue than there has been thus far. If you're actually going to get the creaking political machine to move fast enough, and it's such a small space of time, just a few decades, to actually pull our legs out of the fire.
Let me start because, in fact, our council has held a joint meeting with our equivalents from Great Britain. So it's certainly along those lines. And the heads of the U.S. Science Council, together with the G10 councils, actually meet fairly regularly. So something like that's already going on in the political domain. And let me just say, I'm not as optimistic as the group hug might have indicated. Because, in fact, what I worry about are two things, and my friend David here will immediately recognize them. One is that, A, we are on our way to Arrakis. That is this desert planet that is so famous from the science fiction movie Dune. And B, my concern comes, I can phrase it in another science fiction movie, namely Forbidden Planet. Namely, although we have this marvelous ability to be logical, it's a superstructure on top of something else, where our raw emotions and our intuitions rule. And that actually frightens me. And that's the transition I was talking about.
Does anyone else want to respond to this?
There have been proposals for, in some of the futurist literature around social futures and futures change, around creating, say, in the Westminster system, a third house of the Parliament or the Congress equivalent that would be a representative of generations from the future, who would have veto power, and there would be committees that would assess the long-term consequences of proposals, and it would meet, a certain number of times a year. So with oversight, because of course, future generations are not represented in our political system. So this would be an attempt to redress that. You have something like that in some of the indigenous North American cultures, where there is, the tribal council has a representative from 7 generations hence. So an idea to try and scale that up. Or, there are a number of proposals that have been put up, but there needs to be the political will. I have a colleague who does consulting for government, and during a process, the mayor of the city that he was conducting this process in stood up and said, future generations don't vote. And that reveals the difficulty that people in public and political office have, is that you have to be in office if you want to effect change or create policy. So, it's a very delicate balancing game, because every time you make an unpopular decision, you erode, and it's 51%. You erode down too far, and then you're out of office, and then your chance to actually make change is gone.
We don't need a group hug. We need selfishness. But we need a certain kind of selfishness, which is enlightened self-interest. And the more we develop this global and multi-generational perspective, which is developing, whether it's developing fast enough is another question, the more our self-interest aligns with our global needs. So we just, I'm not talking about a group hug, but it's a propagation of a worldview in which even corporate leaders will see that if they want to be responsible to their shareholders or the descendants of their shareholders, then they have to act in a way that's very different from the way they're acting.
That's what I'm talking about with anger. Like, the general public has to make a much firmer and more accurate effort of holding these people to account. Now, how you do that without sounding completely utopian, I wouldn't know. But getting pissed off is a good start, in my view.
One of the ideas I floated that I think
let me try to give you an alternative, because I think there is an alternative to anger. Namely, that each of us has to kind of become more self-aware. My wife will tell you, I don't watch commercial television, and that's a choice I make, because I understand that the bandwidth in my capacity to process data is taken up by this thing that puts memes into me, downloads memes that I don't necessarily want to be there. To me, one of the most important transitions to be made is for people to take control of their own consciousness. And in this time, we don't do that. We turn that over to the mass media.
And I'd like to put in a quick plug for inspiration. I think anger is valuable, but I think people need to have something they're running towards and seeking rather than just something they're running from and afraid of. And so future visions of where we're going, where we want to go, I think are equally important.
I'd agree with that, though. I wouldn't want to underrate the motivation of the survival impulse either.
I'm wondering, I floated the idea of, which I think I got from Chason, that increasing complexity means increasing fragility. And these discussions make me think that we may be talking the language that worked at the scale of nation states and tribes, but that actually those mechanisms for negotiation may no longer work in a vastly more complex and much larger global structure.
Oh, well, we've already started at a handicap, haven't we? Encounter Big History, please. It's good for all of us, including my career. But no, I mean, I'm trying to think of a way of responding to that that's not, it's less banal than just saying education, because that's precisely what you need and more of it if you're talking about having every single person, individual in the public, aware of their impact. But I think even when you educate, I mean, we've had these messages thrown at us all the time as just the general public, but I mean, how to get those lessons to stick, how to get people to sit up and actually care is different than just education, and that's an open question.
Yeah, to follow on from that, and also the first question, I think what we're getting from a lot of the audience questions, and what I'm feeling at the tail end of a lot of the papers presented, is really compelling stuff that rouses you to want to mobilize in some form of action, but not a lot of clear direction as to how you as an individual, how a government, how an educational body could actually do that. And I know that obviously no one person has the answer there, but I agree with David in the sense that we may be in this age where existing structures are increasingly ineffectual. This idea of get an interdisciplinary panel of academics to advise governments, that may not be a bad idea, but it's not enough. And I think the major thrust that's missing may actually be a very ugly word to a lot of you, and I think it might be market forces, in that I think most of you, regardless of good intent, don't really want to go backwards. You don't want to relinquish that technology that's in your hand. In fact, you want the newest and the best version of it, and you're going to keep wanting that, and you're going to keep consuming that. There is no going backwards on that trajectory. And so what I think we need is to fund private charities. If you're an individual, donate to something like the Gates Foundation, who's actually doing incredible good in the world. The other thing is, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
On the subject of interdisciplinary panels advising governments, that reminds me too much of that episode of The Simpsons where all the smart people start taking over the government of the town. I think it might be more disappointing than we think, especially when, if you were to quote William Buckley, sometimes only a scholar would say something so stupid, or in this case, propose something so stupid. You have to have a little faith in governance in that they are much more in touch with the practical realities of day-to-day business than, say, we are in academia.
Yeah, I think we still, one final point. We still need some form of democratic process and intervention, and it's great to continue that, but it won't be enough. And so I think private investment is a really, really, really big deal. And tech startups and companies that are founding completely divergent courses, completely new and innovative technologies that stand to change the game. In many ways, I think that's our best shot in the near term.
So Joe, and then I'll go to this next question here.
Probably two things. We were talking the other night, I think, about the unreality industries that are created to keep us anaesthetised to what's going on. And as Jim has said, that there's a certain limited amount of cognitive capacity. So the first step to do is to unplug yourself from the unreality industries. Not expect somebody else to do something, start with self. And then, free out the cognitive crud that's getting in the way of giving you the ability to think, we don't all have the ability to do absolutely everything that's necessary to be done. So unplug yourself, give yourself the headspace, literally, to think about what's the contribution that you can make, and then connect with others. And the second thing is, the futurist Elise Boulding famously spoke about this idea of a 200-year-long present, as opposed to the short-term present that we're locked in, that she said that a way to think about this is that we are a link in a chain of humanity that goes 2 links back to our grandparents and 2 links forward to our grandchildren, and this is something that our evolutionarily devised cognitive system can actually grok. So think of ourselves as a chain of humanity, and find a way to pass this on to children or grandchildren, but firstly, unplug.
One thing you see time and time again, actually, is with the rise of complexity in big history, you do have a rise of homogeneity in a lot of cases, and the Anthropocene is certainly one of the best examples of that. If you were to take a microscale example, if you look at the sort of, adaptive radiation of bicycle designs after the idea was initially floated and spread out amongst inventors a couple centuries ago, you had these terrifying, bizarre designs that looked like you could break your neck very easily with, and they suddenly got honed down to a specific homogeneous design that was then just packaged and slightly tooped with all over the world. I think when we're talking about the decline of diversity, it may to some sense, with the rise of complexity, be an inevitability, especially if we're talking about moving on to the next threshold thereafter. But at the very least, if not inevitable, it's not always necessarily a bad thing. Especially if we're talking about, as it is painful to lose, say, world languages. On the other hand, if you're talking about a world of, say, 7 billion or 9 billion potential innovators of new ideas suddenly being able to communicate much more closely and quickly together with less blockage, cultural or linguistic, between them, that might actually lead to innovations that could save our butt at some point.
Of an interesting study recently where a set of psychologists showed that for the majority of people, the future they do not recognize that the future version of themselves is them, and therefore they don't act in accord to set that other future version up to have a better life. Often is the case. And so we keep coming back to this whole thing about time, and that's why I started my comment like we have to be able to see ourselves forward in time, because that's the thing that talks about this long-range planning preserving the legacy for future generations, and understanding that we are that link in the chain. To me, that's in fact the most critical thing for our species to make that next jump.
Yeah, if I may just add, I think in the same direction is to simply increase our circles of compassion. Like, maybe we used to care only about our family or small groups. Nowadays, with globalization, we care about the whole earth. When there are people who are killed somewhere in the world, we have the information fed back into our screens, and we really care about this. And so, to care about things which are even further in the future, yes, we need to think about what Earth will look like in millions of years, what will happen to our sun, etc.
And can I just say that we have a technological basis for this, which is very interesting. Namely, I earlier said, unplug from mass media, but there's this thing called the internet that lets me get closer to more people in the world than has ever existed before. There's Facebook. In other words, social media offers us a way to actually achieve that closeness that Clement just talked about. But I have yet to see that we've actually leveraged that to get to the consciousness that we need to solve this problem.
I'm kind of surprised to hear myself saying this, but I think part of the answer to your question may have to do with religion. And the previous discussion notwithstanding that our historical and present religious institutions have been very repressive in some ways, in many ways, and we have to be aware of that. And yet, they are an example of a kind of institution that has not turned over and changed its focus and its sense of values and goals every 3 years. There is clearly that within us that is capable of this longer-term institutional focus. And I think we have to partly find a way to marshal those capacities in a way that is not repressive, but that helps us move towards the kind of future that we want. I actually have a question that was brought to mind by David's talk, David B. And that is, if you could wave a magic wand and determine what the world population would be, say in 200 years, without any coerciveness, but through some kind of rise of the right kind of behavior, what would an optimum or a good world population be for humans?
I don't need to smother anyone to death with that big group hug then. Okay. Then I would say somewhere between 1 and 3 billion.
If I may actually address the question, which was, what did we find sort of... I have to admit that this whole last panel was unsettling for me. And partly because I think we minimize the difficulty of what it is that we as a species have to overcome. To me, this whole thing is about connections. I have to be able to see me in you, and you need to be able to see you in me. And that's something we're really not good at. And if we could achieve that, I think we would be so far better. And that's what I say is, I was talking about connecting to the future version of myself. And I want you to connect to the future version of yourself, but I also want you to connect to the people around us. To me, that's what's lacking, is that we don't have this compassion, this ability to see ourselves in other people.
It's what Carl Sagan used to call the identification horizon, increasing our identification horizon. But I do have this gizmo in my pocket, and I know you have one too, and I can go bzz, and find out what a friend of mine in Egypt is thinking and what's really going on there, other than what the newspaper says is going on there. And that's a really new thing.
Yes.
And there are these new forms of connection, and I think even identification, that are breaking down the tribal barriers and slowly, painfully slowly, creating a more global sense of humanity.
So that's one thing we can each do.
So
yes,
this discussion has my heart, but not my head. Don't we need more direct mechanisms that bypass all this discussion about religion or even the cosmos or even, and here's a sad thing, even big history? I'm not climate scientist enough to really know what I'm going to say next, but I'm going to give it a go anyway. don't we already have mechanisms to mitigate climate? One is carbon-based trading, control of carbon emissions through trading. We've had a couple of goes at that, but I think we've got it right. But it is a market-based control mechanisms work. And I'm saying that as a lefty, okay? So the second thing is, what happened to carbon offset? So each individual takes responsibility by offsetting their carbon footprint. I've got too large a carbon footprint for my share of the earth. So I try and offset it. But if you had those two things going, you get all the connectivity you want at the global level, and you get the individual responsibility that we absolutely need.
Well, and it engages the market forces that you mentioned if you create those mechanisms.
Sure. So I don't know what happened to those two mechanisms, but I'm not sure if they're being discussed, as perhaps they should be, in Paris at the moment. I'm not saying it's simplistic. I agree with the complexity. I'm not saying it's simplistic and here's two things we do and now it's all fixed. But what happened to those mechanisms? Because we know both of them would appeal to the collective and the individual.
I think if I can intervene, it goes back to this idea of some sort of consensus. And as a historian, what interests me is that over the last few thousand years, consensus has been built at larger and larger scales. And Benedict Anderson, when he wrote about nationalism, talks about these imagined communities. And biologically, we may have a sort of strong attachment to kin, but metaphorically, we can see, 50 million or 100 million people or 300 million people as our kin and start behaving as if they were brothers and sisters. So I think nation states did that very effectively, for better and worse. But I think that means it is not impossible to imagine the emergence of a strong sense of being a human being. This is why I talk about global citizenship. And I very much hope that teaching the big history narrative can be part of that. Because in the big history narrative, you encounter human beings first as a unified species, and then later, right at the end of the story, you encounter them as fighting tribes. Whereas in most history syllabi, in most schools, in most countries in the world, you encounter human beings in your history courses, first of all, as fighting tribes, because you learn about your nation, your tribe. So I do believe there's the possibility of creating this larger sense of human consensus, and something like that will be necessary if people are going to start behaving, I think, in the way you'd like.
And the big question is, can we get there fast enough?
Precisely.
Yeah. Yes.
I was going to say that there is this breakdown in the market valuation of carbon, because I wanted to come to this conference in low and slow to catch the train from Melbourne to here, and it would have cost 3 or 4 times more and taken 12 to 14 hours. And so the valuation of low and slow has absolutely the wrong way around.
Yeah.
It was much cheaper to go high and fast and spend the carbon because the carbon wasn't being
factored in.
I wanted to take a dirigible here from Washington, D.C., but there weren't any.
I mean, you buy the offsets because that's the best that you can do, but you shouldn't need to. I mean, anyway, come and do foresight. That's what
I really do it just very briefly. One of the things that I thought when helping to arrange this conference, and also reading about the Paris conference, is haven't any of these people heard of Skype or Google Hangouts or YouTube streaming, where you can actually have an audience of about 18,000 people in a session?
Don't push that too far. That applies to us too.
Yeah, no, I'll get in trouble. Yeah. But
right in the following sense. One of the major impediments for us, for example, in my country, if you start looking at carbon tax, is the fear that it will cause a loss of jobs and that people will not be able to provide for themselves. And so, yes, there is a fear factor that's actually blocking making progress in our country. It's obvious.
I would say as long as the fear is motivating, then that's good. The thing that worries me, and this is partly what I was getting at earlier, I saw an essay written in, I think it was Vice recently, by a 20-something saying, why should people in my generation even bother to do anything, because they're telling us that no matter what we do, we're doomed. And that mentality I'm worried about.
Yeah.
But if the fear is motivating, then yes, I mean, we do have a lot to be validly frightened about, and there are things we can do, and as long as people make that connection, then sure.
Absolutely. The point is that one of the overriding things that I think some more vigorous sentiments publicly would overcome is the sense of powerlessness, that it's not just people in the general public feel, but even scholars or scientists who study this question. They know exactly what's going on and largely what needs to be done, but then there's an entirely different sphere of people with all sorts of very cynical and sometimes hypocritical concerns that need to bring it about. And
I worry that there's an inevitability of the narrative that we have to make sure that we don't buy into. I mean, when I was in my 20s, nobody could even imagine the Cold War ended in the Berlin Wall falling, or nobody could imagine apartheid being over in South Africa. So things tend to be very nonlinear, and so the fear, the concern, the anger is good, but let's not make people feel that there's this inevitable crash, that there's nothing that can be done about it.
Well, in that case, any feeling is useless.
David,
but
sorry, Joe's been waiting.
Apologies, John.
Just say, if you cast your mind back to the futures cone, one of the classes was preferred futures, but there's also the shadow side of that, the unpreferred futures. It's very often the unpreferred future that you can see coming that leads to the realisation that this path is not to be followed, because that class can include the projected future, probable futures, plausible, and all of them, in fact preposterous ones too. So the recognition that the future that's coming is not the one you want is often a good motivator to then expand the thinking out again, not get locked down in the tunnel vision that comes with abject fear, but to open out the thinking again and say, well, what are the realistic options? What could we, when Kennedy said, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, etc., he was articulating a preferred future that was not yet plausible. They did not yet have the knowledge to do that, but with marshalling the efforts of thousands of people and the creativity that went into that, it went from merely possible, although some said preposterous, becoming plausible, probable, and then it was the projected future on the day of the launch pad. So the same idea, if you see a future that is coming that you don't want, then it's possible to expand the thinking out and find ways to bring about the futures that you do want. And that requires concerted action, but it also requires a clear idea of what that is. Siri, where am I going? That does not compute. The GPS can't tell you where to go, it'll just tell you how to get there once you know.
Kennedy was also saying something very different in private, by the way.
Of course.
In public, he was putting out this inspiring vision because he wanted to inspire people. The tapes from his office showed that in private he was saying, I don't care about space, I just want to beat the Russians. Nonetheless, his inspiring vision that he put out for the public had an effect.
And that inspiring vision can motivate the action and energy and creativity of thousands, tens or hundreds of thousands of millions of people. So part of the business of how do we do this is figure out ways of using better foresight, become more futures literate, and to get together in groups and decide, well, what is the future that you want? And then what steps can be taken to make the first, second, third step. But with a generalised, don't imagine you'll plan it out perfectly, but know where you want to go and know what the first two steps are.
What we have to think about is what drives behaviour. And we've heard much of what drives behaviour here. So fear can drive behaviour. Being motivated and stimulated to do good can. Incentives, the economists got a bad deal in the last 3 days, but actually incentives work, monetary incentives work. And reputation is important, especially in local communities or in professional groups. You'll preserve your reputation ahead of lots of things. So there's a mix of drivers that can create change. One of the things we sometimes do is we try to change attitudes or behaviour, and we've got to change both. So this is a long-term project to try and use a medium-term project to try and change a mix of things. But I hear that, I've got this voice in my head, and it's a clock, and it's ticking. And that's the main message from this last 3 days. How do we respond to that ticking clock?
Thank you very much.